Welcome everybody to this online community session at the Global Solutions Summit, which is entitled Sustainable Infrastructure Standards, Building Back Better Together. My name is Philipp Kühl. I'm the Director for Global Development Policy at the Heinrich-Boell-Foundation in Washington, DC. And I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of the Heinrich-Boell-Foundation and the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University. I think this topic doesn't need much of an introduction, so I will keep my opening remarks very short. I think we all agree that sustainable infrastructure is absolutely critical to all development objectives encapsulated in the Agenda 2030. And it's also no secret that we are dealing with a sustainable infrastructure financing gap, which is expected to grow in the coming years. And therefore, I think in addressing the vast global infrastructure divide, it's absolutely critical that we engage on collective and international action. So I'm happy today that in our panel discussion, we will focus on two recently released frameworks for sustainable infrastructure standards, the Blue Dot Network and FAST-Infra. These initiatives have the potential to foster the adoption of sustainable infrastructure across the globe and are highly relevant and timely in the context of the Build Back Better World initiative announced by the G7 last year, and also the more recent Global Gateway strategy by the EU. And I'm delighted that we will talk about the two initiatives today and discuss the role the G20 and G7 can potentially play to foster progress towards a more common approach aimed at widespread sustainable infrastructure adoption. And with that, I would like to hand it over to our moderator for today's session. Elizabeth Loshaus will introduce our distinguished panelists. Elizabeth is a senior fellow at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University and is currently authoring a comprehensive report on sustainable infrastructure standards with the support of the Heinrich-Boell-Foundation. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the preparation of this event, and over to you.
Thank you, Philip. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I think we have a great set of panelists. Just to build on what you've said, this issue of infrastructure is something that both the G7 and G20 have focused on the last few years. In fact, the G20 came up with the QII principles, the Quality Infrastructure Investment Principles, with this idea that infrastructure is incredibly important, but it has to be the right infrastructure. We have a long history, we meaning the world, of building very large projects that don't meet the economic forecasts and at times create sometimes very massive environmental and social harms and can burden a country with debt. And so it's really critical that we think about, particularly in this COVID recovery, how to promote sustainable and quality infrastructure. And as you said, the Build Back Better World and the Global Gateway have recently been announced by G7 countries. And also there's the UK's Clean Green, and B3W and Global Gateway are an injection of additional funds, but they're also both premised on this idea that public funds alone can't solve the problem. There must be a private match, public-private partnerships, and which is very typical for large-scale infrastructure. And in fact, there are literally trillions of dollars sitting on the sidelines with private investors, whether it is in pension funds or insurance funds or other institutional investors. So really the question is, how do we bring those funds in as well as injecting funds from the public sector? So in this session, what we're going to be looking at is what are some of the barriers, and then what are some of the solutions to bringing it in. And as you said, in particular, we're going to look at these two new global standards for quality and sustainable infrastructure to understand how they might be able to help this, and in particular, what G7 and G20 as entities might do to help both accelerate these standards, but also more largely help with the investments in sustainable quality infrastructure. So before beginning, I am going to introduce the panelists. We have Rowan Palmer, who's in the program management officer in the UN Environment Program in Geneva, and he has been involved. He leads their sustainable infrastructure program, and Roland has been involved for many years on this topic and was really one of the driving forces between UNEP's recent 10 good practice principles for sustainable infrastructure and many other programs. We will then hear from Roland de Marcellus, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Finance and Development in the Bureau of Economic Business Affairs in the US State Department. And in that capacity, he oversees the State Department's engagement in development finance and investment policy and monetary affairs. And that really oversees all those, like the Development Finance Corporation in the US, that are investing and providing public investments in infrastructure. And he has been involved in this topic at the State Department for many years. So it's wonderful speaker on this. And then finally, Christian Desagliz, who is the head of Sustainable Finance and Investment in Global Banking and Markets at HSBC. And he has been at HSBC for quite a while, and in various roles has helped HSBC become one of the world's largest managers in emerging market assets. And Christian has been really involved with FAST-Infra from the very beginning and been a real force behind not only developing it, but bringing in partners around the world. And so we are going to turn first to Rowan and ask him to give us sort of an overview on what are the barriers to addressing sustainable quality infrastructure, the gap, and how could a globally recognized standard help address this gap amongst others. And so Rowan, over to you.
Thanks very much, Liz. So maybe just to back up a little bit to set the scene, when we're talking about sustainable infrastructure, we're talking about any kind of infrastructure in any sector that is environmentally, socially, economically, institutionally sustainable across its entire life cycle. And implicit in this, and particularly in the economic dimension of sustainability, is this idea of high quality and resilient service delivery, which is the reason for building the infrastructure in the first place. And so sustainable infrastructure doesn't refer to any specific type of infrastructure, asset or system or any particular sector necessarily, but it's really about the outcomes of the development and the operation of these various infrastructure systems. And so in reality, there's no binary distinction between sustainable and non-sustainable infrastructure. Really, it's a continuum with varying degrees of sustainability for any infrastructure asset. And there's usually or almost always going to be at least some trade-offs between different aspects of sustainability. A perfect example is if we think of a hydroelectric dam, it may be sustainable in the sense that it's producing clean energy, but it could have negative impacts on biodiversity or on local populations and livelihoods that make it less sustainable in a holistic sense. And so this is really one of the key barriers to the adoption of sustainable infrastructure, is that it's not often clear what exactly a sustainable infrastructure project or a sustainable infrastructure investment is. It's not always clear, which trade-offs can be accepted or not. And this is really what certification standards and taxonomies are trying to help with. But in the case of certification or rating standards in particular, the landscape can be quite confusing to potential users because there are just so many of them around the world. And this is the problem that global standards like the Blue Dot Network or FAST-Infra standards can help to address, is really to develop some kind of a broad consensus on on a common standard to apply and help eliminate some of that confusion and clear up what exactly sustainable infrastructure is. Of course, the success of a global standard like that is dependent on sort of broad recognition. Otherwise they risk becoming two more added into the big pool. So here I think the international development community needs to work together to agree on which standards should be considered the recognized ones, and then to help users to understand and apply the standards, and ultimately to develop infrastructure that meets the standards.
All right, thank you, Rowan, very helpful. And I'm going to now turn to Roland. And Roland, can you tell us, the US, Japan, and Australia just launched the Blue Dot Network Global Certification Framework. Can you give us the context to this and tell us why these countries have embarked on this effort and what the certification will entail, and just broadly introduce us to Blue Dot Network?
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you to you and Rowan for setting the stage so well. As you said, Elizabeth, at the beginning, the challenges we face, particularly climate, but also health and so many other areas, have really shown clearly that we really need to bring private investment into the picture at a scale far beyond where it currently is. Public finances cannot address this challenge on our own. So that is kind of the fundamental goal of, I think, both of our, speaking for Question, both of our efforts, is to try to help bring private sector money to the table. If we're not, then really there's no point to this. I mean, there is some benefit, but it doesn't really address the real problems facing the world, particularly in climate. So yes, we partnered with Australia and Japan in developing the Blue Dot network. I should pause and explain the name Blue Dot, because a lot of people are, why the Blue Dot? But this comes from Carl Sagan in the 1970s, when Voyager looked back at Earth and the pale blue dot in space, the only habitat we'll ever have, so we better take care of it. And try to show capture the sustainability, but they're all in it together. We're all on one planet sharing it. And as everybody has said, we need more infrastructure, but we also need better infrastructure. We need to make sure it is really meeting the needs and is sustainable in every way, environmentally and beyond. And we need the governance, infrastructure, related to infrastructure, and we need to make sure that it is, to the greatest degree possible, meeting the needs of all people, particularly the disempowered. Rowan mentioned the hydro plant. Ideally, when the MDBs are building a hydro plant, hopefully we are looking at those affected communities. Anyway, so trying to really capture across the full range of sustainability for the life of the project. So again, the goal is to bring new investors in and to help them engage while minimizing any negative impacts. But one thing I'd like to stress is Blue Dot is not adding new standards. We are going to leverage existing standards, whether, as you mentioned, Elizabeth, the quality infrastructure standards is a great place. Draw standards, the IFC performance standards, of course, Equator principles. There's so many out there. So our goal is to streamline and harmonize those. One of my Australian counterparts kind of framed it well early in the process. Standards are out there. What he sees described as kind of an operational gap, just in making sure that those standards, they're all there, but are they actually being applied? And then being applied in a way that's certifiable and kind of you can take to market. Rowan had a really excellent point just now about it being a continuum, not in fact, within the blue dot, you get multiple blue dots moving up the continuum. If for projects, for instance, that are particularly effective on climate, let's say, or other aspects. But it is voluntary. And so we're not saying that anybody, a country has to only do blue dot, or if they did a project that's decided not to seek blue dot for that somehow affects other ones. The other, so we're working with the OECD, which has been fantastic in helping us flesh this out. And they released a report last week, which I commend to everybody on Blue Dot, kind of helping describe what the certification would look like. The challenge for us, and for all of us, is a certification that is credible but not too onerous. As we all know, the challenge is finding, everybody talks about infrastructure, but it's a shortage of bankable projects. That's the challenge. That's the constraint. We don't want to add to that with the onerous certification. So, but it has to be credible. So we're trying to strike that balance. The OECD is doing great work in helping us do that. And of course, the way to do that is through consultation. The OECD set up this executive consultation group with 170 representatives of civil society and private sector, and we're getting a lot of input from them. For me, in my Blue Dot journey, not as long as Voyager's journey, but sometimes it seems it. I had a meeting in New York early in the process. In fact, just as COVID was beginning to shut us down. But we had rating agencies, investment funds, angel investors, a huge, great range that you can only find in New York of all of those engaged in infrastructure. And well, I guess to be candid, I was going into slightly like, is this really worth it? Is this really going to work? But I came out of that meeting and wow, I think we've hit on something here. As what we heard across the board was, look, if you can come up with something, we would like to see something that is, it's got to be credible. If you're going to get our money, if I put my money for pension funds and say it's, it's meeting these areas, it's got to be credible to mobilize my money, but not too onerous. So that again is the sweet spot where the OECD is trying to help us hit. So we're on the way to do that. But again, it's going to be a delicate balance, but we want to make sure we get it right. That's why the consultation, that's why I appreciate this event you've organized, but we've been doing quite a bit of consultation, and also with developing countries to make sure we hear their needs and we're not being too onerous in that regard, but also addressing credibility there. So let me stop there, and that's kind of where we are for the moment.
Great, thank you so much. That is terrific. Now I want to, Christian, turn to you. During COP26, FAST-Infra launched its sustainable infrastructure label, along with many endorsements from the financial sector. Can you tell us what FAST-Infra is about and who developed it and
Sure.
the context is?
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this panel. When I was listening to Roland, I said the number of similarities between the Blue Dot network and the FAST-Infra is quite impressive. I think we share so many things. It's also a voluntary process. It's also meant to crowd in private investors and private finance. It's not, FAST-Infra is not a new set of standards. It leverages existing frameworks and existing standards and try to distill the best practices, I would say, from a sustainability point of view. It's not, the name is not as poetic as the Blue Dot network, so no Carl Sagan reference there. FAST actually stands for finance to accelerate the sustainable transition with a focus on infrastructure. It started with another planet, with the One Planet Summit, or the same planet, but not the Blue Dot, but the One Planet Lab, which was set up by President Macron after the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement. And it started really as a multi-stakeholder collaboration between the public and the private sector. So core to it were the OECD, HSBC, where I work, the IFC, the Global Infrastructure Facility, which has been playing a critical role since the outset, and also a climate policy initiative. And the overarching objective of FAST-Infra is really to propose, I would almost say, market-based, practical, inclusive solutions to establish sustainable infrastructure as an asset class, to embed sustainability across the life cycle of infrastructure projects, and also, and maybe most importantly, to crowd in private investment. And I think this multi-stakeholder dimension is important because it's really based on the premise that no single institution can do it all together. That we can either from the private sector or the public sector remove all the many barriers that have been hindering the mobilization of finance. So, look, if we look at what we are trying to solve, the problems we're trying to solve, Roland mentioned not enough bankable projects. Absolutely. The fact that many projects are carbon heavy, and which is compromising the goals of getting to net zero. And the third one is the fact that a lot of institutional investors are very keen to invest in sustainable infrastructure, in the long-term stable returns that the asset class can be yielding, but they have no way to verify which assets are genuinely and certifiably sustainable, in addition to turning a potential profit. So this is really has been the main focus. And Roland, you said that you had this meeting, I think it was in New York, where you believe you had hit on something when coming up with this idea of the Blue Dot label. It was the same thing with the FAST-Infra label. When we started working on it as one of the working groups of this FAST-Infra initiative, we realized that there was a gap in the market, that this type of label was missing. And we took a lot of inspiration from the green bond principles, which was developed a little bit in the same manner by the private sector, but in collaboration with the public sector, with DFIs. And we decided to really, as I was saying, distill the best ESG and climate resiliency and climate adaptation principles from a set of existing standards. So we mapped the label against 25 plus leading frameworks, and we came up with 14 criteria under 4 dimensions of sustainability. So it's a little bit more narrow than the Blue Dot network. We really focus on ESG and climate adaptation and resiliency. So we've got those 4 dimensions: ESG, climate adaptation. In order to meet the label, you need to meet under each of the 14 criteria a certain baseline, which is aligned with the IFC performance standards and the Equator principles. And then you need to be able to show a positive contribution on at least one of the criteria. So and we had to deal with the same type of tension that Roland was mentioning. It cannot be too cumbersome, because otherwise it will hinder the adoption, and at the same time it cannot be too loose. Otherwise it will lose its sustainability value. But we think this label will play a critical role to facilitate investment decisions, to reduce transaction costs, to attract private finance, and also it will play a catalytic role in embedding sustainable criteria into the development of projects. And I think that's really the value of this label, is that it will almost raise the equilibrium, the sustainability equilibrium of the development of sustainable infrastructure across the world. So Elizabeth, as you mentioned, we launched it at COP26 with endorsements from GFANZ, endorsements from the Sustainable Markets Initiative, endorsements from ILN, LTIIA, ICLE, so both sponsors and alliances of investors. We've now, for the last couple of months, we've been in a process of selecting a secretariat and data repository for the label. We are just about to announce who our preferred bidder is going to be. We received some very, very strong responses from various consortiums, 3 consortiums of interested institutions. And now we're in the process of road testing the label. The Global Infrastructure Facility has already taken an IFC project and road testing it. We've got I think about 10 projects which are being road tested now, and we're working on an operationalization book and a guidebook to make it easy for investors and sponsors to apply the label. And we're working in very close collaboration with GFANZ, SMI, and others to encourage the adoption. So that's where we are. We've announced it. We are now in the process of selecting the various organizations that will be in charge of the governance of the label, and we are road testing it and operationalizing it.
Thank you, Christian, and thanks to all 3 of you. Roland, I want to turn back to you and thinking a little bit about the difference. So we've heard about these 2 standards, which obviously share a lot of similar aims and even procedures. But one notable characteristic of the Blue Dot Network is that it broadly considers quality infrastructure, which includes these 4 ESG dimensions that Christian has just mentioned, but it includes other attributes as well of quality infrastructure, like value of money and equal access and focus on long-term development. So given that you are really focusing on unlocking this private capital and crowding it in, do you think it's possible you might be diluting your certification with these elements that perhaps investors are less interested in or are already considering in their own due diligence, like the value for money? And I guess another way of looking at it is, why isn't an ESG focused certification enough? Why do you want to look broadly at quality infrastructure?
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. As Christian spoke, I too was struck by the similarities, actually, more than the differences in our, well, particularly in our goals. And we're both voluntary. And I think we're both, it's open architecture. Anybody's welcome to use either of our processes. And we too are beginning to road test our projects as well. And we've been at this longer, so I think fast infrastructure is faster in developing this thing. But we're being very consultative as we go through it. But I think that's the value of having both. Our goals are both the same. We want to address climate. We want to address the shortage of infrastructure and bring private sector off the sidelines. If FAST-Infra can do that, great. If Blue Dot, if some say, no, I really need to see the Blue Dot to bring my capital in, we're there for that too. So I think it's helpful to have both out there, and whatever's needed, whatever let's say the investor needs, the pension fund says they need, they will use, and we have got both tools for them. Would I, again, from my conversations in New York and the others we've had at OECD with the ECG group, because for many, and each project's going to be different. But infrastructure investments by definition are long-term investments. So many do see value in the broader standards, elements that we have in Blue Dot on financial sustainability, inclusion, and all of those to make sure you value life cycle over the value over life cycle. And for some, that's helpful to make sure that it is sustainable in those ways as well. And so we did hear from many of our stakeholders that they valued that. So that's why they're incorporated. But again, I think we're all believers in the market, because that's who we're looking for, the market to build this infrastructure. So I think the market will function, and people will take which of these processes they find most helpful, or both. I mean, I could easily see a project saying, look, I'm both FAST-Infra and I'm both and Blue Dot, invest in me. So I don't see this as a either or, but as both of us working the same direction to bring money off the sidelines and to deliver quality to particularly the people in the village and developing world are going to use that infrastructure and have it on their books forever.
Great. Thank you, Roland. So Christian, turning back to you, another one of the key differences between FAST-Infra and other standards such as Blue Dot is that FAST-Infra strongly encourages a third-party audit or outside review, but doesn't require it. Whereas Blue Dot has a certification that is going to require an outside audit. Now, given that best practices are to have such an audit, why wouldn't you require it? And do you think that by lacking this absolute requirement, you're going to lead to the perception, whether it's real or just real or otherwise, that the label is being used for, say, greenwashing?
Look, greenwashing has been really front of mind in the development of the label. We've also gone through a very extensive process of consultation in the development of the label by doing roundtables with the key stakeholders of sustainable infra, whether they are developers, DFIs, financial investors, banks. And also for many months, we had an open consultation. I think we received more than 200 pieces of feedback during it. And there is, there are many tensions in the development of the label. One of them was around, should it be certification or should it be self-declaration? When you issue a green bond, you declare, it's self-declaration that your bond is green according to your internal framework, and then you are encouraged to use third-party verifiers and third-party opinions. And the beauty of that system is that you can, in our view, you can achieve scale faster. But it has to be balanced by really important safeguards that will prevent greenwashing or make it really, really difficult. So look, to what we are recommending, and again, it's not, I mean, the self-certificate, the self-declaration and the fact that it's not going to be certified is something that I think is set in stone, but there may be some adaptation and some adjustments to be made. It's going to be a live document and a live labeling system. The Secretariat will be updating it on a regular basis. But what we are for the time being, what we want to do is to, you will, to achieve the label, you will need to meet a discrete set of requirements. So this baseline for the 14 criteria, you need to show, again, as I mentioned, a stretch against one of them, but you also need to publish in the public domain an environmental and social impact assessment, and this has to be produced by a qualified independent firm or a consultant. And because it's a voluntary process, you will also have to, and we're strongly encouraging that owners of the assets, or manager of the assets, seek independent verification from a third party. It's strongly encouraged, but it's not mandatory. And if the owner of the asset decides not to seek a third party verification, they have to explain why, and they have to show, what are and explain why they have not decided to use third party verification. And maybe most importantly, we're creating next to the Secretariat a new institution, which will be the data reporting repository, where all the data pertaining to labeled assets will be consolidated and will be open for all to see. So contrary to what's happening in the green bond mechanism, there is not like a central database where all the information, the data, the sustainability data pertaining to the bond is being held. Here, there will be an open and transparent platform where the data can be consulted by everybody. So we think this transparency is something which will provide a very important counterbalance, I would say, to the risk or mitigation to the risk of greenwashing.
All right, great. Rowan, I want to bring you back into the conversation. Middle and especially low-income countries have the greatest need for a pipeline of these bankable projects that we're hearing about. But it's exactly these countries, for the most part, that are going to have problems with complying and applying for such standards. And given that these are market-based solutions, I don't see either FAST-Infra or Blue Dot having a huge ability to help these countries be able to comply for these two standards. So what is the role of the international community, whether the UN or G20 or G7, in helping build provide technical assistance or capacity development for these countries that most need such a label, but probably will have the hardest time achieving it? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think that a point that that Roland raised and you just raised as well is that, to increase the amount of private investment in sustainable infrastructure, there needs to be the bankable projects for those investments to go into. And as you said, it's primarily governments who are still the main developers of infrastructure around the world. It's governments that need to develop these pipelines of projects. And to do that, it's important that they start incorporating sustainability into their infrastructure planning well upstream of the project level, so earlier in the process. And particularly, you mentioned, you asked about the role of the UN, and this is an area anyway at UNEP that we're focusing on. The UN Environment Assembly, which met a few weeks ago, passed a new resolution on sustainable and resilient infrastructure. And this is really an area that the resolution focuses on and asks member states, with support of UNEP and development partners, ask member states really to systematically integrate sustainability into infrastructure planning through, among other things, the application of the international good practice guidance principles for sustainable infrastructure, which were developed by the UN and really focused on creating the enabling environment for sustainable infrastructure, on thinking outside the box about how to deliver various services through infrastructure investment, and on integrating sustainability into the upstream phases of the infrastructure lifecycle. And so this is where we at UNEP and a lot of our partners are really focusing these our capacity building and technical assistance efforts to complement some of the more downstream capacity building and technical assistance at the project level that's going on. And the idea is that if this more upstream work is done effectively, then applying standards like the FAST-Infra or Blue Dot or any of the others, maybe standards that are tied to specific MDBs or other lenders, but basically by doing the upstream work, complying with sustainability standards further downstream towards the project level becomes less of a barrier because the groundwork has already been laid. And ultimately, as I said, the upstream support needs to be accompanied by also the project level technical assistance and capacity building as well. But the important thing is that I think giving middle and low income countries the types of support they need really requires better coordination amongst the international development community and the finance community and the various partners that are helping to provide this assistance and capacity building, and do it really in a more deliberate and coordinated and complementary way. This is something we're currently piloting through an initiative called the Sustainable Infrastructure Community of Learners, but this is also still in the early phase. So I think it's an area where more work is needed, and where organizations like, well, the various UN agencies, but also the G20 and other partners can really take the lead in working more closely together to deliver more coordinated and better targeted support.
Thank you, Rowan. So taking this upstream and bringing it back downstream, Roland, there's been a commitment of the G7 to building back better and trying to address the investment gap, infrastructure investment gap. Specifically, do you see the US and its other G7 partners as requiring or somehow incentivizing countries to use the Blue Dot Network in their public investments in their development finance?
Thank you very much. Again, I go back to your previous question, so a quick comment. And what Roland was discussing, capacity building is so important. And that's something we've heard, I'll bet Cristiano's heard it as well in a lot of his consultations, is we've got to help countries meet these standards. And so that's why we would hope that in all of these efforts, we can upscale capacity building in this domain. And, there are lots of project preparation facilities and others, but that's going to have to be part of the solution. On your question about, these other G7 efforts and requiring, no, I don't see requiring. Again, going back to voluntary, this is a voluntary idea, but certainly encouraging, we would hope, in adoption standards. I kind of see this, we've got a number of parallel tracks moving out into the future with, building back better and all of the other global gateway, all the other initiatives. We've got FAST-Infra, Blue Dot, all moving forward. And there could be some convergence as they adopt, standard, but hopefully we'll be encouraging at least each other as we move forward. And then we'll have to see. I really think this is one where the market's going to decide. You mentioned, incentives. Again, I think the markets and the institutional investors and others, they're the ones who are providing the rewards, and hopefully in terms of financing. Just one example, it's not in infrastructure, but something that stuck with me at a meeting of the Paris Club, the Paris Forum, where the borrowing countries come. And the government, we were discussing the importance of transparency. And it was an amazingly eloquent presentation by one of the developing countries in Africa as to where they saw the value. And they said they bought it all, they concluded with, and we get 50 basis points off of our interest rate when we do this. And that's the type of thing, that's the reward that people are going to hopefully see, and they see the capital move into the project. So we're hoping that we're creating these tools and they become useful and they'll be validated by the market, or it won't. If it's not, then we can look for new solutions. But it's got to be meaningful to the market, and that's got to be where incentives come from.
And Christian, do you see FAST-Infra in some way supporting this sort of development of these the developing countries or emerging market governments and developers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the goal again is to create an asset class. So it's something which is global, but there is a really strong focus on emerging markets, and some of the other initiatives that are being advanced by FAST-Infra are specifically targeted at emerging markets. So de-risking mechanisms that we're recommending. Also, we're developing an end-to-end platform to facilitate development, a tech platform to facilitate development and financing and syndication, all the way to a marketplace of sustainable infra projects. So there is a strong focus on emerging markets. I think the advantages of that label will be to make the asset more bankable, more easily financeable, and that should offset some of the the costs of and the burden of demonstrating that an asset is aligned with the label. So we think that's obviously an important incentive. But if you take a step back, I think it's important also that we make life easier to sponsors and developers and investors. So if we can somehow harmonize the sustainability criteria between those two meta standards, I think we're achieving a lot. If we can facilitate kind of like joint adoption, I think as Roland was mentioning just before, of the label, and Elizabeth, you've been discussing that also. I think these are important steps that will not add barriers, but on the contrary, will facilitate the life of sponsors and investors. And also, we need to create or to facilitate the capacity building, project preparation, which will embed in the development of the projects higher sustainability criteria. So the Global Infrastructure Facility, which has been co-leading the development of that label, is a key partner, and they are the ones that will be helping emerging countries integrate, embed higher sustainability criteria in project development. We're working, as I mentioned, with GFANs, with SMI, to also facilitate and encourage adoption and provide capacity building and provide training and the CFLI, the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative, with its pilots in India and Indonesia. So Global Infra Facility is the implementation partner for CFLI in India and Indonesia. So it's also a way to help embed the label in those really important countries. So I think, yes, specific support has to be given. Ideally, we would like to see a regulatory regime for assets which are labeled as sustainable to be a little bit less punitive than it can be for infra assets, for insurance and banks. So I think there could be some support provided also by the regulator for assets which have been deemed sustainable, so less risky from a climate and from a climate risk point of view, and more adapted and resilient to climate change, that could deserve a better regulatory treatment.
Great. Well, we are coming close to time. I'm going to let Rowan have a final word on this. Rowan, from the international community's perspective, these initiatives, which are extremely timely and important, have been developed largely, even though there's been broad consultation from a small group of countries. Any final thoughts on how to make sure that there's really good input from many of the target client countries in the development and eventually uptake of any sort of global standard.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, I mean, I think, even though certain countries or other stakeholders may not have been involved in the process so far, I think it's never too late to involve them. And, I think also the process of starting to take these standards and applying them to projects and working with countries to do that will help facilitate sort of feedback and input. I mean, Christian mentioned, that it's a living document and is likely to be sort of fine-tuned as it goes. So I think that's part of the process. I also think organizations like the G7 and the G20 are, and of course, UN partners as well are very well placed to convene and bring different parties together. Now that these standards are starting to be rolled out as well, it's actually provides a sort of a good opportunity and a good moment for engagement. So I think that, I think that certain organizations and groups like the G20 and the UN and the teams developing these standards that clearly have very closely aligned objectives. It's a great time to work together and convene people to discuss.
Great. Well, we are at time, but a big thank you to all of our speakers and also to the Heinrich-Boell-Foundation for its support of the whole effort. And we thank you all and hope to continue this conversation offline.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you.